What would you do if the woman who raised you after your mother's death confessed to stealing your entire inheritance, while a shadowy stranger hunted you down with a knife in the dead of night? In a single phone call, my stepmother, Janet, shattered my world, gloating as she handed my mother's legacy to my stepsister, Tiffany, unaware that I'd been warned, prepared, and ready to fight back with secrets she'd never see coming. Join me on this roller coaster of betrayal, danger, and redemption, and if this story grips you as much as it broke me, hit that subscribe button to help us reach our first 1,000 subscribers. The phone buzzed on the scratched wooden desk of my Minneapolis hotel room, its shrill tone slicing through the quiet hum of the air conditioner. I glanced at the screen. Janet's name flashed in bold letters, a name that never brought good news. At 28, I thought I'd escaped the suffocating grip of my family's toxicity. My career in pharmaceutical sales kept me on the road most weeks, a deliberate choice to distance myself from the chaos of my dad's house in Boston. But as I answered the call, Janet's voice slithered through the line like venom, her words sharp enough to cut through steel. You think you deserve that money? That trust fund belongs to Tiffany now. She's better than you'll ever be. Her tone dripped with smug satisfaction, each syllable a dagger aimed straight at my heart. I gripped the edge of the desk, my knuckles whitening as I tried to steady my racing pulse. The Minneapolis skyline stretched out beyond my window, a sea of twinkling lights against the dusk, but it might as well have been a void. Janet's words echoed in my mind, dragging up years of buried resentment. The trust fund wasn't just money. It was my mother's legacy. The last piece of her I had left after she passed when I was 16. She'd built her pharmaceutical consulting business from nothing, pouring her heart into ensuring I'd have a future free of the struggles she'd faced. That trust fund was her promise to me, a safety net to chase my dreams without fear. And now, Janet, my stepmother of 10 years, was gloating about stealing it for her daughter, Tiffany. Thanks for letting me know, I said, my voice icy calm, betraying none of the storm brewing inside me. I could almost hear Janet's smug expression falter through the crackling connection, a sharp intake of breath revealing her surprise. She'd expected tears, maybe screaming or pleading, anything but this quiet acceptance. That's all you have to say? She pressed, her disappointment palpable. Tiffany needs that money for her wedding and new house. You'd just wasted on your meaningless sales career. Her words stung, but I didn't flinch. Instead, I let the silence stretch, my mind racing with the weight of what she didn't know. 6 months ago, I'd had a late-night conversation with Mr. Harrison, my mother's old lawyer, a man who'd known her since her first business deal. His voice had been grave as he warned me about Janet's suspicious inquiries into the trust fund, forged documents, backdated signatures, even attempts to impersonate Mom's executor. Together, we'd put safeguards in place, legal protections that would make any unauthorized access not just impossible, but prosecutable. I'd documented everything. Every call, every veiled threat, every manipulation. Janet had finally overplayed her hand, and I was ready to call her bluff. Is there anything else? I asked, keeping my tone level, almost bored. The silence on the other end was telling, a crack in her armor. You've always been such a disappointment, she spat, her final attempt to provoke me. Your stepsister deserves this more than you ever will. I ended the call without another word, my hands trembling not from fear but from the adrenaline coursing through me. I walked to the window, staring out at the city below, the lights blurring as my mind churned. This wasn't just about money, it was about everything Mom had fought for, everything she'd wanted for me, and I'd be damned if I let Janet take it away. My name is Gabriella Mitchell, and I've spent the last decade trying to build a life free from the shadow of my family's dysfunction. My job in pharmaceutical sales isn't glamorous. Endless client meetings, long flights, and nights in generic hotel rooms. But it's mine, built from scratch through grit and determination. I'd graduated top of my class in business school, landed a prestigious job, all while working part-time to support myself. The trust fund had stayed untouched not because I didn't need it, but because accessing it meant dealing with Janet's interference. Every visit home brought snide comments about my privileged position, as if my success was something to be ashamed of, while Tiffany's every minor achievement was celebrated like a royal decree. Tiffany, 3 years younger than me, had been 13 when Janet married my dad. From the moment they moved into our house, the tension was immediate and suffocating. Janet made it clear that Tiffany was the star of the household. Her grades, her hobbies, her tantrums all took precedence. Meanwhile, my academic scholarships, my acceptance to business school went unnoticed by my dad, who was too buried in work to see the way. Janet systematically pushed me to the side. The real wake-up call came during my college graduation. I'd finished top of my class, landed my first sales job, and done it all on my own. But Dad couldn't make it and insisted he stay home because Tiffany had a minor cold. That was the day I knew nothing would change unless I changed it myself. I moved out the next day, cutting contact to a minimum and focusing on my career, but the trust fund remained a looming specter, a constant reminder of the battle I'd been avoiding. 6 months ago, when Mr. Harrison called with his warning, everything clicked into place. Janet had been playing a long game, waiting for the right moment to strike. But I wasn't the vulnerable 16-year-old she'd once manipulated. I was my mother's daughter, and I'd learned from the best about protecting what was mine. My thoughts drifted to the last time I saw Mom, lying in her hospital bed, her once vibrant face pale and gaunt from the cancer that ravaged her. She'd held my hand so tightly, her grip weak but fierce, and whispered, "Always be prepared, Gabriella. People will try to take what's yours, but you're stronger than they think." I was 16 then, too young to fully grasp her words, but they'd rooted deep in my soul, sprouting into a quiet resolve that had carried me through the years. Now, as I stood in this sterile hotel room, those words felt like a lifeline. Janet might think she'd won, but she had no idea who she was dealing with. I sank into the stiff hotel chair, pulling my laptop onto my lap with a trembling sigh. The screen lit up, casting a harsh blue glow across the dim room as I opened the folder labeled Janet Evidence. It was a digital vault of everything I'd collected over the months. Voicemails where she'd sneered about my selfishness, emails to the bank with forged signatures, screenshots of Tiffany's social media posts, flaunting wedding venues she couldn't possibly afford on her teacher's assistant salary. It was all there, meticulously organized, a testament to the lessons Mom had drilled into me about preparation and vigilance. I scrolled through the files, each one a brick in the wall I'd built to protect myself. But beneath the anger and resolve, there was a hollow ache in my chest. I missed Mom so fiercely in that moment, the kind of longing that clawed at your insides and left you gasping. I pulled out the small photo I always carried in my wallet. Mom and me at her office, both of us laughing over some forgotten joke. Her hair was swept back in a messy bun, her eyes sparkling with the kind of confidence I'd always aspired to. The trust fund wasn't just money, it was her belief in me, her way of saying, I could do anything. I touched the photo gently, a quiet promise forming in my chest. I won't let her take this from us, Mom, I whispered into the empty room. I glanced at my watch, 9:47 p.m. Tomorrow, I'd fly back to Boston. Tomorrow, I'd face Janet head-on. But tonight, I needed to plan, to steel myself for the battle ahead, because this wasn't just about money. It was about justice, about reclaiming what was rightfully mine. I opened a new document on my laptop, titling it Next Steps, and began to type, each word a step toward the reckoning I knew was coming. Janet had thrown the first punch, but I'd be the one to land the last. The ache in my chest lingered as I closed my laptop, the harsh glow of the screen fading into the dimness of the Minneapolis hotel room. Janet's words still echoed in my mind, each syllable a reminder of the battle I'd been avoiding for years. But to understand how I got here, staring out at a city skyline that felt more like a cage than a refuge, I had to go back to the days when my world still had Mom in it, to the years that followed her death, and to the slow, insidious way Janet had tried to dismantle everything Mom had built for me. My mother, Eleanor Mitchell, was a force of nature. a woman who'd clawed her way up from nothing to build a successful pharmaceutical consulting business. She'd started with a single client, a tiny office in our basement, and a dream to make a difference in an industry riddled with inefficiency. By the time I was 10, her company was thriving, her name respected in boardrooms across the country. But more than her success, I remember her warmth, how she'd tuck me into bed after late nights at the office, her hands still smelling faintly of ink and coffee, and tell me stories of women who'd defied the odds. "You can be anything, Gabriella," she'd say, her voice steady as a heartbeat, "but you have to be ready to fight for it." That fight took on a new meaning when she was diagnosed with cancer at 47. I was 14 then, old enough to understand the gravity, but too young to grasp the void it would leave. For 2 years, she battled with a ferocity that stunned her doctors. Chemotherapy, surgeries, experimental treatments, all while still running her business from a hospital bed. She'd smile through the pain, her eyes bright with a determination I didn't fully appreciate until she was gone. The trust fund she left me wasn't just money. It was her final act of love, a safety net to ensure I'd have the freedom to chase my dreams without the weight of the world on my shoulders. "It's your future, Gabriella," she'd whispered in one of our last conversations, her voice frail but fierce. "Don't let anyone take it from you." She passed when I was 16, leaving a hole in my life that nothing could fill. My dad, overwhelmed by grief, withdrew into himself, burying his pain in work as a construction manager. He'd leave before dawn and return after midnight, his eyes hollow, his voice a ghost of what it used to be. I learned to fend for myself, cooking dinners from canned goods, studying late into the night by lamplight, trying to hold onto the pieces of the life Mom had left behind. But 2 years later, Dad did something I never expected. He married Janet. Janet came into our lives like a storm, all sharp edges and calculated smiles. She was a widow with a teenage daughter, Tiffany, and a knack for playing the doting wife when it suited her. But behind closed doors, she was a manipulator, her words laced with venom disguised as concern. "Your mom wouldn't want you to be so selfish," she'd say whenever the trust fund came up, her tone dripping with false sweetness. "We're all family now, you should share with Tiffany." But we weren't family, not in the way that mattered. Tiffany, 13 when they moved in, was a mirror of her mother, petty, entitled, quick to cry when she didn't get her way. Janet made sure Tiffany's every achievement, no matter how small, was celebrated lavishly, while my own milestones went unnoticed. My academic scholarships, my acceptance to business school, they were footnotes in a household where Tiffany reigned supreme. Living with Janet was like walking on eggshells. She'd rearrange Mom's things without asking, her books shoved into dusty boxes, her photos tucked away in the attic, claiming it was for a fresh start. But I saw it for what it was, erasure. She wanted to wipe Mom's memory from the house, from Dad, from me. And Dad, lost in his own grief, didn't see the way Janet slowly poisoned our relationship, planting seeds of doubt with every whispered comment about my stubbornness or ingratitude. By the time I was 18, I felt like a stranger in my own home. My only solace, the small box of Mom's keepsakes I'd hidden under my bed. A few letters, a locket, her business journal. The real tension started 6 months ago when Mr. Harrison called me late one night, his voice heavy with urgency. "Gabriella, I've uncovered something disturbing," he said, the words crackling through the line. "Janet's been making inquiries about the trust fund. Forged documents, backdated signatures, even attempts to impersonate your mother's executor. She's escalating." My stomach churned as he explained how close she'd come to breaching the account before the bank flagged it. Together, we'd put safeguards in place, additional security measures, legal protections that would make any unauthorized access not just impossible, but prosecutable. "She's determined," Mr. Harrison warned. "Be careful." What Mr. Harrison didn't know, what I hadn't told anyone, was that I'd stumbled upon something even darker while cleaning out Mom's old office in the attic last year. Tucked inside a locked drawer, I'd found a letter from her dated just weeks before her death. Her handwriting was shaky, the ink smudged in places where her tears must have fallen as she wrote, "My dearest Gabriella. It began, "If you're reading this, I hope it's because you found your strength. Janet is dangerous. She visited me in the hospital a month ago, demanded I change my will to include her and Tiffany. When I refused, she threatened me. Said I'd regret it, that she'd make sure you suffered if I didn't comply. I don't know what she's capable of, but I know she's not to be trusted. Be careful, my darling. Protect yourself. Always. Love, Mom." That letter haunted me, its weight heavier than any legal document. I didn't tell Mr. Harrison about it, not yet, because I wasn't sure what to do with it, or if I could even trust my own memories of those final days with Mom. Had I seen Janet at the hospital? Had I heard her voice in the hallway, sharp and demanding, as Mom lay dying? The memories were foggy, blurred by grief, but the letter brought them into stark relief. I couldn't shake the feeling that Janet's threat wasn't empty, that she'd been planning something far worse than financial theft. 3 months ago, I decided I couldn't sit idly by. I hired a private investigator, a gruff man named Daniel, who'd come recommended by a colleague. I handed him Mom's letter and told him to dig into Janet's past, discreetly. What he found turned my blood cold. Janet had a history of financial exploitation, with 2 previous marriages ending in lawsuits over stolen assets. One ex-husband had even claimed she'd poisoned him to hasten his death. A claim dismissed for lack of evidence, but chilling nonetheless. "She's a predator," Daniel said over a grainy video call, his face etched with concern. "And she's got her sights set on you. I think she's planning something big, Gabriella. Watch your back. And don't eat or drink anything she gives you." His words sent a shiver down my spine, and I started carrying a burner phone and a small recording device everywhere just in case. Meanwhile, Janet's behavior grew more erratic. She'd call me at odd hours, leaving voicemails laced with veiled threats. "You can't hide behind your mother's money forever, Gabriella." Tiffany, on the other hand, seemed oblivious or complicit. She'd post on social media about her lavish wedding plans, tagging me in photos of venues I knew she couldn't afford on her teacher's assistant salary. The tension was suffocating, and I knew Janet was waiting for the right moment to strike, but what she didn't know was that I'd learned from the best. My mom had taught me to always be prepared, to think 3 steps ahead, and I was ready. The Minneapolis hotel room felt colder than it had just moments ago, the air thick with the weight of Janet's betrayal and the lingering echo of her venomous words. I sat on the edge of the stiff bed, staring at the small photo of Mom I'd pulled from my wallet, her smile a beacon in the storm brewing inside me. The trust fund wasn't just money. It was her belief in me, her final gift to ensure I could build a life on my own terms. And now Janet thought she could rip it away, handing it over to Tiffany like a trophy for her daughter's vanity. But I wasn't the same grieving 16-year-old she'd once manipulated. I'd learned from Mom to be prepared, to strike back when the moment was right. That moment was now. I pulled my laptop back onto my lap, the Janet evidence folder glowing on the screen like a battle map. Every voicemail, every forged document, every screenshot of Tiffany's ostentatious wedding plans. It was all there, a fortress of proof I'd built over months of quiet vigilance. I knew Janet's call wasn't just a taunt. It was her declaration of war. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly know, was that I'd been warned by Mr. Harrison, my mother's old lawyer, 6 months ago. He'd called me late one night, his voice heavy with urgency, detailing her attempts to access the trust fund through forged signatures and backdated paperwork. Together, we'd fortified the account with legal safeguards that made any unauthorized access not just impossible, but prosecutable. Every move Janet made had been logged, documented, and stored in this digital vault. She thought she'd won, but she'd walked straight into a trap. I dialed Mr. Harrison's number, my fingers steady despite the anger simmering beneath my skin. He answered on the second ring, his voice familiar and reassuring, a lifeline in the chaos. "Janet finally made her move," I said, cutting straight to the point. "She claims she's transferred everything to Tiffany." There was a pause, then a low chuckle from Mr. Harrison, the kind that carried both relief and resolve. "I was expecting this," he replied. "I got an alert about attempted access to the account this morning. Don't worry, Gabriella. The security measures we put in place worked exactly as planned. Every attempt was logged and documented. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, the tension in my shoulders easing just a fraction. So nothing's actually been transferred, I asked, needing to hear it again. Not a penny, he confirmed. But we've got her dead to rights on attempted fraud. The documentation is bulletproof. Would you like me to proceed with the next steps? I thought about all the years of manipulation, the snide comments, the way Janet had slowly poisoned my relationship with my dad, the veiled threats that had escalated over the past few months. I thought about Mom's letter, the one I'd found in her locked drawer, warning me of Janet's dangerous nature and her hospital room threats. And I thought about the private investigator's chilling discoveries, Janet's history of financial exploitation, the dismissed claim of poisoning an ex-husband, the sense that her schemes went far deeper than money. Yes, I said firmly, my voice steady as steel. It's time to end this. Send the evidence to the family lawyer and copy my dad on everything. I want him to see exactly what his wife tried to do. Consider it done, Mr. Harrison said, a note of pride in his tone. And Gabriella, your mother would be proud. She always said you were smarter than anyone gave you credit for. I smiled faintly, the words a small comfort in the storm. But before I could respond, my burner phone buzzed on the bedside table. A text from Daniel, the private investigator I'd hired 3 months ago, after reading Mom's letter. The message was short, but it turned my blood to ice. Urgent. Janet hired someone to follow you. They tracked you to Minneapolis. Get out of the hotel now. My heart stopped, the room shrinking around me as panic clawed at my throat. I glanced at the hotel window, the Minneapolis skyline suddenly menacing in the twilight. A faint shadow moved outside my door. A creak in the hallway sent my pulse into overdrive. I didn't think, I just acted, grabbing my laptop, the photo of Mom, and the burner phone, shoving them into my bag as I called Mr. Harrison back on my main line. Someone's here, I whispered, my voice trembling for the first time that night. I think Janet sent them. His response was immediate, sharp with urgency. Leave through the fire exit. I'm calling the police and sending a contact to get you to safety. I didn't wait for more instructions. Slipping into my coat, I cracked the door just enough to peek into the hallway. It was empty, but the creak came again, closer now, from around the corner. My heart pounded as I darted toward the fire exit at the end of the hall, the metal door heavy under my shaking hands. The stairwell was dark, the air damp and cold, and I took the steps 2 at a time, my breath ragged in my throat. Behind me, I heard the faint sound of heavy footsteps, deliberate and unhurried, as if whoever it was knew I couldn't escape. But I had to. I had to get out, had to survive, for Mom, for myself. I burst out into the alley behind the hotel, the crisp night air hitting me like a slap. A cab idled at the corner, its yellow paint a beacon in the darkness. I threw myself into the back seat, slamming the door as I barked at the driver to take me to an address Mr. Harrison had texted. A safe house on the edge of the city. My hands shook as I clutched my bag, the photo of Mom pressed against my chest like a talisman. The police later confirmed they'd detained a man outside my hotel room, a rough-looking guy in his 40s carrying a photo of me and a knife in his pocket. He claimed he was just delivering a message, but refused to say who'd hired him. Janet denied any involvement when questioned, but my burner phone had recorded her earlier voicemail. You'll regret crossing me, Gabriella. The police kept the recording as evidence, though they couldn't yet tie it directly to the man in custody. That night, safe but sleepless in the safe house, a nondescript apartment with barred windows and a single flickering light, I realized this wasn't just about money anymore. It was about survival. Janet wasn't just a manipulative stepmother. She was dangerous, maybe even deadly, as Mom had warned in her letter. I opened my laptop and booked an earlier flight home to Boston, my client meeting be damned. I had a family matter to attend to, and this time, I wouldn't just confront Janet, I'd make sure she could never hurt me again. I landed in Boston the next morning, the autumn air crisp and biting as I stepped off the plane. My dad's house, The one I'd grown up in. The one Mom had filled with laughter before cancer stole her away. Looked the same as ever, but something felt different. Maybe it was me. I'd called ahead to let Dad know I was coming, but I hadn't mentioned Janet's phone call, or the man in Minneapolis, or the knife that could have ended my life. Some conversations needed to happen face to face. I found them in the living room, Dad, Janet, and Tiffany, sitting around like a mockery of the family we'd never been. Janet's smug smile faltered when she saw me walk in, replaced by a flicker of confusion at my calm demeanor. "Gabriella," Dad started, his brow furrowing with concern. "I didn't expect you until later. Is everything okay?" I set my bag down, pulling out my phone and the file Mr. Harrison had sent over yesterday. "Actually, Dad, we need to talk," I said, my voice steady despite the storm inside me. Janet called to tell me she'd emptied my trust fund and given everything to Tiffany. I thought you should see exactly what happened. The living room of my dad's Boston house felt like a battlefield as I stood there, the weight of Mr. Harrison's file in my hands heavier than any weapon. Janet's smugness had evaporated, replaced by a pale, pinched expression that flickered between panic and defiance. Tiffany sat on the couch, her arms crossed, her face a mask of indignation, while Dad's concerned gaze shifted between me and the documents I'd just handed him. "Janet called to tell me she'd emptied my trust fund and given everything to Tiffany," I repeated, my voice steady despite the tremor of adrenaline still coursing through me from the events in Minneapolis. "But that's not all she's done. Every attempt to access the account was documented. Every forged signature, every manipulation. It's all here." Janet's face went ashen, her lips parting in a silent protest as Dad opened the file, his hands trembling slightly. The room was silent save for the faint rustle of paper as he scanned the evidence Mr. Harrison had meticulously compiled. Email chains with the bank, forged signatures in Janet's handwriting, recorded voicemails where her voice dripped with malice. I watched his expression darken with each page, the lines on his face deepening as the truth sank in. "She's lying!" Tiffany jumped in, her voice shrill, her face flushing red. "She's always been jealous of me." But her words lacked conviction, and I noticed her glance dart nervously toward her mother, as if seeking reassurance that was no longer there. I pulled out another document, the trust fund statement, pristine and untouched. The numbers, a silent testament to my preparation. "The money's still there, safe," I said, my voice cutting through Tiffany's outburst like a blade. "Janet's attempts failed because I was warned months ago. I took precautions." I turned to Dad, softening my tone but keeping my resolve firm. "I'm sorry you had to find out this way, but you needed to know the truth." His hands shook as he reached the final page. A detailed log of Janet's failed attempts to transfer the funds. Each timestamp a nail in the coffin of her schemes. "Janet, what did you do?" he whispered, his voice barely audible, his eyes glistening with a pain I hadn't seen since Mom's funeral. "I did this for our family," Janet protested, her voice rising to a desperate pitch, but it wavered, cracking under the weight of her own lies. Tiffany needed, "Stop!" Dad's voice broke through hers. Sharp and raw, a sound I hadn't heard from him in years. "Just stop. These documents. You tried to forge my signature, lied to the bank, and..." He trailed off, his gaze falling back to the papers, as if hoping they'd somehow change. But they didn't. They couldn't. The truth was there in black and white, undeniable and damning. I took a deep breath, steadying myself for the next blow, the one I'd been dreading but knew I couldn't avoid. "There's more," I said softly, pulling Mom's letter from my bag, the one I'd found in her locked drawer a year ago. The paper was worn at the edges, the ink smudged in places where her tears must have fallen as she wrote her warning about Janet's hospital room threats. I handed it to Dad, my voice barely above a whisper. "Mom wrote this before she died. She warned me about Janet, about how she came to her in the hospital, demanded she change her will, threatened her when she refused." Dad's hands trembled as he unfolded the letter, his breath hitching as he read her words. each line a dagger to his heart. She threatened your mother on her deathbed. His voice broke, and for the first time in years, I saw my dad cry. Not the quiet tears of grief I'd seen after Mom's passing, but raw, anguished sobs that shook his whole body. He clutched the letter to his chest, his shoulders heaving as the weight of his blindness crashed down on him. I knelt beside him, my own tears falling as I placed a hand on his arm. "I'm sorry, Dad," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. "I should have told you sooner, but I needed proof. I needed you to see it for yourself." He nodded, unable to speak, his eyes fixed on Mom's handwriting as if it were a lifeline pulling him back to her. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by Tiffany's soft sniffles from the couch. I turned to her, my voice softening but firm. "Tiffany, did you know your mother hired someone to follow me, to scare me, or worse?" Her eyes widened, genuine shock flickering across her face as she shook her head frantically. "What? No, I didn't know." But as she stammered, I noticed her hands trembling, clutching a necklace I recognized. It was Mom's, a delicate silver chain with a small phoenix pendant that Janet had claimed was lost years ago. Had Tiffany taken it, or had Janet given it to her as a trophy? The sight of it twisted something deep inside me, a mix of anger and pity I couldn't untangle. "You're wearing Mom's necklace," I said quietly, my voice steady but laced with pain. Tiffany's hand flew to the pendant, her face paling as she stammered. I found it in Mom's things. She said it was okay to keep it." I didn't know whether to believe her, not yet. There was too much at stake. Too many unanswered questions, but I couldn't focus on that now. I turned back to Janet, my voice cold as ice. "The police will want to talk to you," I said. "Mr. Harrison has already filed reports with the bank fraud department, and they're investigating the man they caught outside my hotel room in Minneapolis. The one with my photo and a knife." Janet's composure shattered, her eyes wild with panic as she hissed, "You planned this. You set me up." "No, Janet," I replied, my voice calm but unyielding. "You planned this. I just made sure I was ready when you did." Dad stood, his hand still trembling as he held Mom's letter, his face a storm of grief and rage. "Janet, I want you out of this house tonight," he said, his voice quiet but firm, each word a hammer striking stone. "And Tiffany, I need time to think about what comes next." Janet's mouth opened, then closed, her protest dying in her throat as the reality of her situation sank in. Tiffany burst into tears, but they weren't her usual manipulative sobs. These seemed raw, uncertain, as if she were finally grasping the depth of her mother's actions. "Dad, please," she begged, her voice breaking. "I didn't know." But Dad just shook his head, his eyes fixed on the letter in his hands, as if seeing Janet for the first time, and not in a good way. I stepped back, moving to the window where I used to watch for Mom to come home from work, the glass cool against my palm. The weight of 12 years of manipulation hung in the air, a suffocating fog that had finally begun to lift. Janet gathered her things with shaking hands, throwing accusations and excuses around in equal measure. "You'll regret this, Gabriella!" But they bounced off me like rain on stone. Tiffany followed her mother, her tear-streaked face a mix of fear and confusion, the phoenix necklace glinting in the dim light as she passed. I didn't stop her, didn't say a word. There would be time for answers later, time to decide if forgiveness was possible, or if Tiffany had been complicit in ways I hadn't yet uncovered. As the door slammed shut behind them, the house fell into a heavy silence. Dad sank back into his chair, Mom's letter still clutched in his hands, his eyes distant and haunted. I sat beside him, the space between us filled with unspoken regrets. "I failed you," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion as he stared into the empty fireplace. "After your mom died, I was so focused on not being alone that I didn't see what was happening right in front of me." I reached for his hand, squeezing it gently, my own voice soft but firm. "We both made mistakes, Dad. I could have told you sooner about Janet's behavior, but I wanted proof first. I needed you to believe me." He nodded, a tear slipping down his cheek as he looked at me, really looked at me for the first time in years. "You're so much like her," he said, a faint smile breaking through the pain. "Your mom, she'd be so proud of you." The words hit me harder than I expected, a wave of grief and love crashing over me as I leaned into his embrace, the first real hug we'd shared since Mom's funeral. In that moment, I felt the first threads of healing begin to weave between us, fragile but real, a promise of something better to come. The weeks following that confrontation in Dad's living room felt like waking from a long, suffocating nightmare. The house, once heavy with the weight of Janet's manipulations, began to breathe again, its walls echoing with memories of Mom instead of the tension that had defined it for so long. Janet faced the consequences of her actions swiftly. Mr. Harrison's evidence was airtight, and the bank fraud department moved quickly. She was charged with attempted fraud and financial exploitation, and after further investigation, suspicion of conspiracy to commit harm for the man detained outside my Minneapolis hotel room. Phone records linked her to a burner phone used to contact him, though she denied everything, claiming she was being framed. In the end, she took a plea deal to avoid jail time, paying restitution, and agreeing to a lifetime ban from any financial profession. The last I heard, she'd moved to Arizona to live with her sister, a shadow of the woman who'd once terrorized my life. Tiffany stayed in Boston, working as a teacher's assistant and keeping her distance. A few days after the confrontation, she sent me an email, her words halting and uncertain. "I didn't know about Mom's plans, Gab. I swear. I always thought you had everything handed to you. Mom made it seem like you were the privileged one. But now I see she was just jealous of what your mom built for you. I'm sorry." Attached to the email was a photo of Mom's Phoenix necklace, the one I'd seen around her neck that night. She wrote that she'd mailed it back to me, along with a small note apologizing again for taking it. When the package arrived, I held the necklace in my hands, the silver cool against my skin, and felt a mix of relief and unease. Was Tiffany truly innocent? Or had she known more than she let on? The question lingered, a small thorn in the healing process, leaving me to wonder if forgiveness was possible, or wise. But amidst the chaos and unanswered questions, something beautiful began to take root. Dad and I started rebuilding our relationship, piece by painful piece. It wasn't easy. There were long, tearful conversations in the kitchen where Mom used to help me with homework. Nights where we sat in silence, each grappling with our own guilt. "I failed you," he said one evening, staring into his coffee cup as the steam curled into the air. "After your mom died, I was so focused on not being alone that I didn't see what was happening right in front of me." I reached across the table, taking his hand, my voice soft but firm. "We both made mistakes, Dad. I could have told you sooner about Janet's behavior, but I wanted proof first. I needed you to believe me." He nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears, and for the first time in years, I saw the man he'd been before grief had hollowed him out. One evening, as we sorted through Mom's old office, now a library Dad had set up in her honor, we found her business journal tucked beneath a stack of papers. Inside was a letter addressed to me, dated just weeks before she passed. "My dearest Gabriella," it began, her handwriting shaky but resolute. "If you're reading this, I hope it means you've found your strength. I'm leaving you more than money. I'm leaving you the freedom to choose your path. Don't let anyone dim your light or tell you what you deserve. You're stronger than you know, smarter than they give you credit for, and capable of anything you set your mind to. Trust yourself. I do. I love, Mom." I broke down reading it, the words a warm embrace from beyond the grave, a reminder of the woman who'd fought for me even as she fought for her own life. Dad pulled me into a hug, his own tears falling as he whispered, "She was always thinking ahead. Even when she was fighting for her life, she was fighting for yours." With the trust fund secure, I took a leap I had always dreamed of. I started my own consulting firm, focusing on streamlining operations for pharmaceutical companies, just like Mom had done. I named it Phoenix Solutions, a nod to the necklace and the idea of rising from ashes. The firm grew quickly, attracting clients who appreciated my direct approach and industry knowledge. I hired a small team, including Sarah, a brilliant analyst who reminded me of Mom with her fierce determination and sharp mind. Every decision I made carried echoes of Mom's wisdom, her lessons woven into the fabric of the business. The trust fund became the seed money for something greater, a legacy of my own, built on the foundation she'd left me. Dad retired from his construction job and threw himself into volunteering at a grief counseling center, helping families navigate loss without losing themselves. He started coming by my office for lunch every Wednesday, sometimes bringing stories of Mom I'd never heard, like how they'd met at a business conference, her spilling coffee on his shirt and laughing it off with a boldness that won him over instantly. Other times, we'd talk about the future, about the firm, about the life we were rebuilding together. "You know what your mom used to say about you?" he asked one day, a smile playing on his lips as he sipped his coffee. "She said you were like a diamond. Pressure just made you stronger." The words hit me like a wave, a reminder of the resilience Mom had seen in me even when I couldn't see it myself. On the 5th anniversary of Mom's passing, Dad and I visited her grave together, bringing fresh flowers from her favorite garden, a tradition we'd started after Janet left. The cemetery was quiet, the air crisp with autumn's edge, and as we stood there, I shared a memory I'd buried deep. In her last days, I began, my voice trembling. Mom held my hand and said, "You're my greatest achievement, Gabriella. Never forget that." I hadn't let myself remember those words until now, afraid they'd break me. But standing there with Dad's hand on my shoulder, I realized they hadn't broken me. They'd built me. I placed a small replica of her business logo, a phoenix rising from ashes, on her gravestone, my fingers lingering on the cool marble. "You gave me wings, Mom," I whispered, my voice choking with tears. "I'm flying now just like you wanted." Looking back 5 years after those tumultuous events, I'm amazed at how much has changed. Phoenix Solutions now operates in 3 cities, and I've started a scholarship fund in Mom's name for girls from broken homes, giving them the chance she fought to give me. Dad's found love again, a kind widow named Clara who shares his passion for helping others. And I've learned to forgive, though not forget. Tiffany and I have started talking, slowly rebuilding something fragile but real. She returned Mom's necklace with a tearful apology, and while trust will take time, I'm open to trying. The hardest lesson I learned wasn't about money or betrayal. It was about standing up for myself, about realizing that true strength isn't just surviving the fire, but rising from it with love in your heart. Mom knew that, and she made sure I'd learn it too. As I sit in my office, Mom's letter framed on the wall behind me, I know that while some wounds never fully heal, love and resilience have the power to transform even the deepest scars into strength.